The air in the federal courthouse hung heavy with tension on that crisp March morning, a day that began like any other, but would soon unravel into a spectacle no one could have predicted. The towering marble pillars and polished wooden benches of Judge Marshall Davis's courtroom stood as silent witnesses to the storm brewing within. Davis, a man whose name had long been whispered in legal circles with a mix of fear and disdain, was in a particularly venomous mood. His salt and pepper hair, once neatly combed, was disheveled from restless hands running through it, and his sharp gray eyes glinted with an irritability that bordered on malice. Known for his iron grip on his courtroom and his unapologetic contempt for those he deemed beneath him, Davis had built a reputation as a judge who bent the law to his will rather than serving it. Lately, though, his behavior had taken a darker turn, erratic, almost unhinged, especially when conservative figures crossed his path. "No coffee in my courtroom!" he barked, his voice a jagged edge slicing through the morning stillness. The young clerk, Emily Harper, flinched as if struck, her freckled cheeks flushing crimson. Barely 25, with wide hazel eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her auburn hair, Emily had taken the job hoping to learn from a legal titan. Instead, she found herself a punching bag for Davis's moods. She clutched the offending mug tighter, whispering an apology as she scurried to dispose of it. "And tell that defense team," Davis continued, his tone rising, "if they're not here in 2 minutes, I'm issuing contempt charges." The packed gallery, reporters, onlookers, and a few anxious family members shifted uneasily, their murmurs a low hum against the judge's thunderous commands. Davis stormed to his bench, his black robe swirling like a tempest, his face already flushed with irritation. At 58, he carried the weight of decades on the bench, his once lean frame now softened by years of indulgence, though his presence remained imposing. His reputation preceded him, a man who wielded his gavel like a scepter, crushing dissent with a relish that had earned him both enemies and reluctant admirers. But today, something felt different, his anger sharper, his control more brittle. The gallery watched in rapt silence as he settled into his seat, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the polished oak. "Your Honor," Emily approached cautiously, her voice trembling slightly, "Vice President Vance has arrived for his testimony." Davis's expression darkened instantly, a shadow passing over his features. His lips curled into a sneer, not even attempting to mask his disdain. "Well, isn't that special?" he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Make sure he knows this isn't the Senate floor. In my courtroom, his title means nothing." The words landed like a gauntlet thrown down, and the atmosphere shifted, electric, charged with the promise of confrontation. When JD Vance entered, the room seemed to hold its breath. At 40, the vice president exuded a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to Davis's bluster. His dark brown hair was neatly trimmed, his suit impeccably tailored, but it was his eyes, steady, hazel, and unflinching, that drew attention. They carried the weight of a man who had risen from humble roots in Ohio to the corridors of power, a journey marked by resilience and an unshakable belief in justice. He nodded respectfully to the court staff, his movements measured, almost deliberate, as if he sensed the storm awaiting him. Davis watched him like a hawk, his fingers still tapping, his gaze predatory. "Let's get something straight," Davis announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, thick with contempt. "I don't care what position you hold in Washington. In this courtroom, I am the law. Is that clear, Mr. Vance?" The vice president met the judge's glare with calm resolve. "Crystal clear, Your Honor," he replied, his tone even, almost disarmingly polite. "I'm here simply as a witness to the truth." Davis scoffed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the walls. "Truth? We'll see about that." His gaze shifted to the defense table, where attorney Michael Reynolds, a wiry man in his late 30s with a mop of sandy hair and a reputation for tenacity, sat poised to begin. "Now let's get this circus started." Reynolds rose, adjusting his glasses, but before he could utter a full sentence, Davis interrupted. "For the record," the judge snapped, "I'm already tired of the political theatrics in my courtroom." He shot a pointed look at Vance, his lip curling. "This isn't a campaign rally." Reynolds cleared his throat, undeterred. "Your Honor, we're simply establishing the context of Mr. Sterling's charitable—" Davis cut him off with a derisive laugh. "The context? The context is that your client is accused of tax evasion, period. I don't need a history lesson about his so-called charitable work." The gallery stirred, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. Sterling, a soft-spoken philanthropist in his 50s with thinning gray hair and a gentle demeanor, sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly. He'd spent years building the Faith and Family Foundation, pouring his wealth into community projects, only to find himself ensnared in what he believed was a politically motivated prosecution. Every time Reynolds mentioned Sterling's contributions, soup kitchens, scholarships, youth centers, Davis shut him down with increasing venom. "Irrelevant! Move on! I won't warn you again!" The gavel slammed so often that Emily, hunched over her stenotype, struggled to keep pace, her fingers trembling as she typed. The judge's hostility wasn't just judicial, it felt personal, a vendetta cloaked in robes. When it was time for Vance's testimony, Davis's behavior spiraled further into chaos. "Stand up straight when you take the oath," he snapped, though Vance's posture was already impeccable, his shoulders squared with quiet pride. "And speak clearly. I won't have any political doublespeak in my court." "Your Honor," Vance began, his voice steady as a metronome, "I can attest to Mr. Sterling's financial transparency regarding the Faith and Family Foundation." Davis cut him off, rolling his eyes with theatrical flair. "Oh, here we go! Another conservative fairy tale about family values." The gallery shifted uncomfortably, even the prosecution team exchanging uneasy glances. Assistant U.S. Attorney Laura Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense air, pursed her lips, clearly troubled by the judge's blatant bias. But Davis was just warming up. He leaned forward, his face reddening, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Let me be clear. I've seen enough rich conservatives try to hide their money behind charitable facades. Your presence here doesn't impress me, Mr. Vice President. In fact, it makes me question the defendant's character even more." Vance remained composed, a rock against the judge's raging tide, but something in his unshakable calm seemed to ignite Davis further. The judge's hands shook slightly as he shuffled through papers on his desk, his eyes darting nervously to a specific folder. A thin, unmarked file that had appeared that morning, its contents a mystery to all but him. "I have here," Vance continued unfazed, "documented evidence of Mr. Sterling's charitable contributions, including the March Foundation meetings." Davis exploded, his voice a near shout. "Those records are inadmissible!" No objection had been raised, yet his reaction was visceral, almost panicked. Reynolds stood, his voice firm. "Your Honor, on what grounds are—" Davis's face turned beet red. "Don't you dare question my rulings! One more word, and you'll be joining your client in contempt." The prosecutor, Chen, shifted in her seat, her discomfort palpable. This wasn't judicial discretion. It was a vendetta unraveling in real time. "Your Honor," Vance interjected, his tone still respectful but edged with steel. "These documents were properly submitted during discovery." Davis sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, were they? And I suppose your fancy White House connections had nothing to do with that? Let me tell you something about your kind, Mr. Vice President. You think you can waltz into my courtroom with your political privilege and—" Reynolds found his courage. "Objection, Your Honor! This is completely inappropriate!" Davis roared, slamming his gavel so hard the wood groaned. "Silence! I will not be lectured about appropriateness in my own court, especially not by some conservative puppet in his. Vance cut in, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. Your Honor, perhaps we should discuss the specific contents of the March 15th meeting. The change in Davis was instantaneous, like a predator caught in a trap. The rage in his face melted into something colder, sharper. Fear, perhaps? His hand froze midair, gavel trembling, as he stared at Vance as if seeing a ghost. Those meetings are not relevant to these proceedings, he stammered, his voice suddenly unsteady. But his eyes kept flicking to that mysterious folder, its edges worn as if he'd clutched it too tightly that morning. Not relevant? Vance asked quietly, his tone almost gentle, though it carried a weight that silenced the room. That's interesting, Your Honor, considering those meetings directly involve charitable contributions to... Davis slammed both hands on his bench, cutting him off. Enough! One more word about those meetings, and I'll have you removed! The gallery watched, breathless, as the judge's composure fractured further. His hands shook visibly now, papers scattering as he tried to regain control, his breathing ragged. Something was unraveling, something bigger than Sterling's case, and everyone could feel it. The courtroom hung in a fragile stillness, the kind that precedes a thunderclap. Judge Marshall Davis's outburst had left an indelible mark. His authority, once an unshakable monolith, now teetered on the edge of collapse. His hands, gnarled from years of wielding power, trembled as he gripped the edges of his bench, his knuckles whitening. Sweat beaded on his furrowed brow, glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps. That unmarked folder, its contents still a secret, sat like a ticking bomb among the scattered papers, drawing his gaze again and again. The gallery, a sea of wide eyes and hushed whispers, watched as the man who had ruled this room with an iron fist began to crumble. In fact, Davis rasped, his voice taking on a manic edge, I'm holding you in contempt right now, Mr. Vance. You think your position protects you? You're nothing but a Trump lackey in an expensive suit. His words spat venom, but they lacked the conviction of moments before. More a desperate lashing out than a command. JD Vance, still standing at the witness stand, didn't flinch. His hazel eyes remained steady, a quiet strength radiating from him that seemed to infuriate Davis even more. Your Honor, Vance replied, his voice smooth as polished stone. My position has nothing to do with this. But since you mentioned protection, perhaps we should discuss the Liberty Foundation's protection payments. The room froze. Davis's face drained of color, shifting from flushed red to a ghostly white in an instant, as if Vance had plunged a dagger into some hidden wound. How dare you? I mean, what payments? He stammered, his voice cracking. There were no... Guards, remove this man from my courtroom. The court officers, two burly men in crisp uniforms, hesitated at the edges of the room. Officer Daniel Torres, a veteran with a weathered face and a moral compass that had guided him through 20 years of service, exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Sarah Klein, a younger woman with sharp features and a growing unease. They'd enforced Davis's orders countless times, but this felt different, wrong. Vance, sensing the shift, reached calmly into his briefcase, pulling out a crisp manila folder. Actually, Your Honor, he said, his tone measured but firm, I have some very interesting bank records here. Would you like to explain the monthly deposits from offshore accounts that coincidentally align with your rulings against conservative defendants? The gallery erupted into a low buzz, like bees sensing danger. Davis's eyes widened, his pupils darting wildly as he lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at Vance. Shut up! He screamed, his judicial demeanor shattering completely. You have no right, no authority. I am the law here, me, not some conservative bootlicker who... Vance held up a single document, its stark black ink a silent accusation. Your signature on these authorization forms suggests otherwise, Your Honor. The judge's reaction was visceral, shocking even his own staff. He lurched over the bench, his robes billowing, his fingers stabbing the air. You planted those. This is a setup, a conservative conspiracy. He caught himself, but too late. The word conspiracy hung in the air, a self-inflicted wound. Vance tilted his head slightly, his voice soft but piercing. A conspiracy? Interesting choice of words, Your Honor, especially given your private meetings with certain activist groups. Davis's face contorted, a mask of fury and panic. I will not be interrogated in my own court, he bellowed, his voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. You think you can come in here with your smug face and your evidence? He spat the word like it was venom, his hands clawing at the papers on his desk as if he could bury the truth beneath them. Vance pressed on, relentless yet calm. Evidence that shows a disturbing pattern, like the Thompson case last month, where a small business owner lost everything because you wouldn't allow evidence of his charitable work to be presented, just like today. Davis's laugh was a jagged, unhinged sound, echoing off the high ceiling. The Thompson case? That conservative fraud deserved what he got. They all deserve it. These people think they can hide behind their faith and family values while... He stopped, realizing he'd veered too far into revelation, but Vance seized the opening. Or perhaps, he interjected, pulling another document from his folder, we should discuss the Wilson hearing, where you mysteriously sealed all records just hours after meeting with representatives from the Liberty Foundation. Davis's face twitched violently, a tic betraying his unraveling composure. How do you know about... He clamped his mouth shut, but the damage was done. Know about what, Your Honor? Vance pressed, his voice steady as a drumbeat. The meeting? Or the $100,000 that appeared in your offshore account the next day? The gallery erupted, a wave of gasps and murmurs crashing through the room. Davis slammed his gavel repeatedly, each strike more desperate than the last. Order! Order! I will have order! His voice cracked, panic seeping through the cracks in his facade. This is all fabricated! A conservative plot to... Vance didn't let up. Like Mrs. Anderson's case? A grandmother who lost her life savings because you wouldn't let her explain where the money came from? Interesting how the company that sued her donated to your re-election campaign just weeks before. Shut up! Davis screamed, his composure a distant memory. He stood, his robes disheveled, pointing wildly at Vance. You have no right, no authority. I am the law here, me! Vance's voice cut through the chaos like a lighthouse beam through fog. No, Your Honor, you're not the law. You're supposed to serve it, like when you took your oath of office, the same day you opened that account in the Caymans. Davis staggered back, as if struck, then lunged forward again. Guards! Arrest this man for contempt! Seize those documents! All of them! Now! What are you waiting for? His scream was a raw, primal sound, but the officers still didn't move, their faces etched with conflict. Before they do that, Your Honor, Vance said, opening yet another folder, perhaps we should discuss why you're so eager to seize these particular documents. Davis paced behind his bench like a caged beast, his eyes wild. I don't have to explain myself to you. I am a federal judge. My decisions are final. My authority is absolute. Vance's response was thoughtful, almost reflective. Absolute authority. Seems to be a recurring theme with you, Your Honor. Just like in the Williams case last week, where you ordered all evidence of your private meeting sealed. Davis froze mid-stride, his breath hitching. How did you... Those records were supposed to be... He caught himself again, but the slip was a chasm widening beneath him. Supposed to be what, Your Honor? Vance asked. Destroyed? Like the records from the Liberty Foundation meetings? Davis roared, his face a mask of fury. Enough! You self-righteous conservatives think you can come into my courtroom and expose... He stopped, the word expose dangling like a noose. Expose what, exactly? Vance pressed, his voice unwavering. The systematic abuse of judicial power, the coordinated targeting of conservative defendants, or perhaps the payments you've been receiving to... Davis lost all control. He grabbed his gavel and hurled it across the courtroom, the wooden hammer sailing past Emily's head and crashing against the wall with a splintering thud. She yelped, ducking behind her desk, tears welling in her eyes. "You want to talk about abuse of power?" Davis shrieked. "I'll show you abuse of power! Officers, I want this man in handcuffs now! Anyone who refuses my order will be joining him in jail!" The room fell into an eerie silence, the judge's heavy breathing a stark counterpoint to the tension. Torres and Klein still hadn't moved, their hands hovering near their belts, duty warring with conscience. "Last chance, Mr. Vance," Davis snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "Hand over those documents and submit to arrest, or I'll make sure you never set foot in another courtroom again." Vance opened another folder, his movements deliberate. "That's an interesting threat, Your Honor. Almost identical to what you told Sarah Mitchell before dismissing her discrimination case, right after your meeting with CEO James Peterson." Davis's face went ghostly pale, his lips trembling. "What? How did you—" Vance continued, unrelenting. "Peterson, who deposited $500,000 into your Cayman account. The same Peterson who hosted that private yacht meeting last month, the one where 7 other judges were present, all of whom mysteriously ruled in his favor the following week." "You have no right!" Davis screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "Those records are privileged. Those conversations were private. You illegally—" Vance's voice softened, a quiet blade slipping through the judge's hysteria. "Private like the recordings from your chambers? The ones where you explicitly told your clerk to lose evidence that would have exonerated 3 conservative defendants?" Emily burst into tears at her desk, her sobs breaking the silence. "He made me do it!" she cried, her voice raw with guilt. "He said he'd ruin my career if I didn't!" "Silence!" Davis roared. But his authority was a hollow shell now, crumbling with every word. "None of this is admissible. You can't prove—" Vance interrupted, his tone final. "Actually, everything was obtained legally. Your own security cameras caught the midnight document shredding. Your own phone recorded the threats. Your own signature authorized the transfers." Davis lunged forward, reaching desperately across his bench toward Vance's evidence folder. "Give me those files! I order you—" "Order denied!" A new voice boomed from the back of the courtroom. Heads turned as a team of FBI agents strode down the center aisle, their dark suits a stark contrast to the chaos. The lead agent, a tall man with a chiseled jaw and steel-gray eyes, held up his badge, its glint catching the light. "This court is now under federal investigation. Judge Marshall Davis, stay where you are." The courtroom seemed to shrink as the FBI agents advanced, their footsteps a steady drumbeat against the polished floor. Judge Marshall Davis recoiled, his back pressing against the wall behind his bench, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. "You can't do this!" he shrieked, his voice a high-pitched wail that betrayed the last vestiges of his crumbling bravado. "I have immunity! I have connections! Do you know who I am?" His robes, once a symbol of untouchable authority, hung askew, stained with sweat and desperation. The lead agent, Special Agent Thomas Reed, stopped at the foot of the bench, his steel-gray eyes locking onto Davis with unflinching resolve. Reed, a man in his late 40s with a weathered face etched by years of chasing corruption, exuded a quiet intensity. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, Your Honor," he said, his voice low and firm, "including your recent meetings with the Liberty Foundation, your offshore accounts, and your coordinated efforts to target conservative defendants." Davis's gaze flickered wildly around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The gallery, reporters scribbling furiously, onlookers leaning forward in rapt silence, watched as the man who had wielded power like a cudgel was stripped bare. JD Vance stepped forward, his presence a calm counterpoint to the chaos. "A plot?" he interjected quietly, his words slicing through Davis's hysteria. "The only plot here was your systematic abuse of power, Your Honor. Every biased ruling, every backroom deal, every attempt to silence the truth. It all ends today." Davis's trembling finger jabbed at Vance, his voice hoarse with rage. "You planned this. You and your Trump-loving conspirators set me up." Vance shook his head, a faint sadness in his eyes. "No, Your Honor. You set yourself up. We simply gave you enough rope to hang yourself. Your words and actions today have confirmed everything we already knew." The agents moved closer, flanking the bench, and Davis made one final, desperate bid for control. "I am a federal judge," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You can't arrest me. I am the law. I am the law." Yuan, his fists pounded the bench, scattering papers and toppling that mysterious folder, its contents spilling across the wood. Bank statements, meeting notes, signatures in his own jagged scrawl. The agents didn't hesitate this time. Reed nodded, and two of his team stepped forward, their movements swift and practiced. Davis lunged toward his chambers, a wild, animalistic cry escaping his throat, but they caught him mid-stride, pinning his arms as he thrashed. "You don't understand!" he wailed, his voice breaking into sobs. "They made me do it. The Foundation, they have dirt on everyone. If I talk now—" Reed raised an eyebrow, his tone deceptively calm. "That's interesting. Tell us more about this Foundation, Your Honor." But Davis had caught himself, his survival instinct kicking in too late. His face twisted into a sneer, though his hands still trembled in the agent's grip. "I want my lawyer," he spat. "And when this is over, you'll all pay for this humiliation." Vance stepped forward, producing one last document with a quiet gravity. "Speaking of payment, perhaps you'd like to explain these transfer records. 7 judges, all receiving similar payments on the same days you did, all ruling against conservative defendants in coordinated cases." The gallery erupted in shocked whispers, a tidal wave of realization crashing through the room. This wasn't just one corrupt judge. It was a network, a web of greed and power stretching far beyond this courtroom. Vance's voice rose slightly, carrying across the silence that followed. "The evidence suggests this was a systematic effort to use the judicial system as a political weapon. But justice isn't meant to be a weapon, Your Honor. It's meant to be a shield, protecting all Americans equally." Davis stopped struggling, his shoulders slumping as the full weight of his exposure settled over him. His face, once a mask of arrogance, was now a hollow shell, defeat etched into every line. Behind him, court officers moved swiftly, sealing his chambers with yellow tape, their faces grim. Emily Harper, still at her desk, was surrounded by FBI agents, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands as she recounted Davis's threats. "He said he'd ruin me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He made me shred files, lose evidence. I didn't want to, but I was scared." Her confession hung in the air, a testament to the fear Davis had wielded like a weapon. As the agents led him away in handcuffs, Davis turned one last time, his eyes locking onto Vance with a bitter, venomous glare. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped. "There will always be others like me. You can't stop us all." Vance met his gaze, unflinching. "You're right about one thing, Your Honor. There will always be those who abuse power, but there will also always be those who stand up against them. That's what makes our justice system work. Not the corruption you represent, but the courage of those who fight against it." Davis snarled, but the fight had drained from him. His final walk of shame out of the courtroom, flanked by agents, his head bowed, was a powerful symbol of justice reclaiming its ground. The aftermath rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Davis's arrest ignited a firestorm of investigations across multiple jurisdictions, toppling a network of corrupt judges as evidence mounted and witnesses found their voices. The Liberty Foundation, once a shadowy player, was thrust into the spotlight, its leaders scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. But perhaps the most poignant moment came days later, when Sterling's case was revisited. A new judge, a stern but fair woman named Margaret Ellis, with silver hair and a reputation for impartiality, reviewed the evidence Davis had suppressed. She dismissed the charges in a single decisive ruling, her voice steady as she declared, "There is no basis for this prosecution. Justice demands the truth, not vendettas." Sterling, free at last, stood outside the courthouse, the spring sun warming his tired face. A man of quiet faith, he'd never sought the spotlight, only the chance to help others. "I just wanted to do good," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank God for people like Mr. Vance, who wouldn't let the truth be buried." Beside him, Vance offered a small, genuine smile. His work done, but his resolve unshaken. The crowd that gathered, ordinary citizens, many of whom had felt the sting of an unjust system, cheered, a collective release of hope restored. In that courtroom, on that March day in 2025, justice had been tested and found its footing. It wasn't decided by those who sought to control it, but by those willing to defend it. Men and women of courage who stood firm against the tide. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps, the message was clear. Corruption might persist, but so would the fight against it. For every Davis, there would be a Vance, a Sterling, an Emily, imperfect, human, but resolute. And that in the end was the heartbeat of a nation worth believing in.